Hello there. This video is to demonstrate to the viewer that the Anglo versus Celtic dichotomy that we see in Britain today is entirely fictitious and based upon memetic rather than empirical data. So firstly, we Britons were Celtic until the invasion by the Anglo-Saxons, right? Wrong. Depends what you mean, really. Celtic is just a term for the languages stemming from the Iron Age Hellstack culture. And honestly, I feel no great need to go into this any further because there's no visible group of people claiming Britons were replaced by Norisi Celts, from Austria. And as far as I'm aware, there's no academic debate about any genetic impact of Celtic peoples in Britain. In fact, it doesn't seem to have been until around the 17th century that Britons began to think of themselves as Celts. And a century later, the English as Germans, for that matter. When English sovereignty, of course, at the time was threatened by the Catholic Stuarts, and the only solution was the German Protestant Hanoverians, who, of course, raised, the King's Own German Legion, for instance. He broke the traditional lifestyle of the Highlands and created the clearances, made them basically uninhabited today. And so basically it wasn't until the 18th century that the English started to think of themselves as German. So where does this idea come from? I shan't go too deeply into the historical aspect of the supposed migrations in this video, as this is meant to demonstrate the genetic aspect, the genetic piece of the puzzle, But suffice to say, the sources are sketchy to say the least. You're basically looking at Gildas and Bede, Gildas in the 6th century and Bede in the 7th century. You're looking at sort of writers having made these claims several hundred years after the supposed event itself, and this is the pyramid citation that other historians will use. Of course, I believe Bede was the one, of course, who said that the Irish replaced the Scots, for instance, which also is, by all genetic accounts, doesn't seem to be true. And in the same book, claimed that the Picts were originally from Syria. It's just LARPy meme nonsense. I suppose briefly, though, I feel obliged to mention the one Scottish chronicler, as far as I'm aware, that mentions the English as like a separate group from the Celtic peoples. It was the Scottish chronicler Saint of Odden. He mentions that the foundation of the Northern Alliance and the Battle of Brunanburh, where the purpose of the alliance between Constantine II of Scotland, or of the Picts, Yawain, king of the Strathclyde Welsh, and the Vikings. It started as an effort to push the Ashen, the English, back into the sea, quote-unquote. However, it's completely unclear whether or not they were under the impression that the English were German, or, just that the elite at some point had come from the sea, right? Also, if you think about the impracticality of actually forcing sort of 3 million people into the sea, probably is the case that they were just referring to the elite. The most comprehensive study on the topic when it comes to the genetics, though, which has been studied for over 20 years with a huge sample size, in supposedly the relevant area of supposed settlement by the Anglo-Saxons having been completed by geneticist, doctor and writer Dr. Stephen Oppenheimer, whom here I shall quote verbatim. "The other myth I was taught at school, which persists to this day, is that the English are almost all descended from 5th century invaders, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes from the Danish peninsula, who wiped out the indigenous Celtic population of England. The story originates with the clerical histories of the Dark Ages. Gildas in the 6th century AD and Bede in the 7th century AD tell of Saxons and Angles invading over the 5th and 6th centuries. Gildas in particular sprinkles his tale with rivers of blood, description of Saxon massacres. And then there's the well-documented history of Anglian and Saxon kingdoms covering England for 500 years before the Norman invasion. But who were those ancient Britons left in England to be slaughtered when the legions left? The idea that Celts were eradicated culturally, linguistically, and genetically by invading Angles and Saxons derives from the idea of a previously uniformly Celtic English landscape, but the presence in Roman England of some Celtic personal and place names doesn't mean that all ancient Britons were Celts or Celtic-speaking. The genocidal view was generated, like the Celtic myth, by historians and archaeologists over the last 200 years, with the swing in academic fashion against migrationism, seeing the spread of cultural influence as dependent on significant migrations. Over the past couple of decades, archaeologists are now downplaying this story, although it remains a strong, underlying perspective in the history books. Some geneticists still cling on to the genocide story. Research by several genetic teams associated with University College London has connected in recent years on proving the wipeout view of the basis of the similarities of male Y chromosome gene group frequency between Frisia, North Germany, and England. One of the London groups attracted press attention in July by claiming that close similarities were the result of genocide, followed by a social selection apartheid that enhanced Anglo-Saxon reproductive success over Celts. The problem is, the English resemble, in this way, all the other countries of northwest Europe, as well as the Frisians and Germans. Using the same methods of principal components analysis, I have found greater similarities of this kind between the southern English and Belgians than the supposedly Anglo-Saxon homelands at the base of the Danish peninsula. These different regions could not all have been waiting their turn to commit genocide on the former Celtic population of England. The most likely reason for their genetic similarities between these neighbouring countries and England is that they all had similar prehistoric settlement histories. When I look at exact gene-type matches between the British Isles and the continent, there were indeed specific matches between the continental Anglo-Saxon homelands and England, but these amounted to only 5% of modern English male lines, rising to 15% in parts of Norfolk, where the Angles first settled. There were no such matches with Frisia, which tends to confirm a specific Anglo-Saxon event, since Frisia is close to England, so would be expected to have more matches. Yeah, and I basically agree with everything Oppenheimer says there. If I could just sort of briefly go in and explain some of the concepts there. Now, I'd be willing to bet some of you have seen what I would call mean maps, like this one. I mean, look, it's even got a helix, at a jointy angle. It must be right. Right? Nope. The source actually cites it to a Eupedia page that has no copy of the image in question. Imagine my shock. Even if true, however, it's not immediately obvious that the supposed methodology here is actually appropriate, collating several haplogroups that are sort of vaguely present in Germanic populations and suggesting that these are all quote-unquote Germanic haplogroups that would therefore have some corresponding component of Germanic admixture. It's only really seen on the west coast of Norway in Scandinavia due to ancient British migrations in the Stone Age and up until sort of the Mesolithic Age. So even on the face of it, the map is clearly misleading, to say the least. They'd have you believe that like a native British haplogroup, which is present on the western coast of Norway, is therefore Norwegian and therefore Germanic. It's kind of silly. But and that's assuming this is even a real, a real study that this refers to. I mean, I couldn't find anything. But if this is a real study on the methodology as claimed here, so on the face of it, if we are to assume that it is in earnest, then the methodology is still wrong and sort of leads to a misleading, set of ideas. And I honestly can't tell you how often authors will actually sort of misrepresent their own data in their abstract, because it's only the conclusion that people read. Most people don't actually understand esoteric subjects like molecular biology and genetics and phylogenetics in particular. It's just a case of a lying priesthood, really. Now, there has been one. That's right, one. And of course, this was one of the groups that Professor Oppenheimer was working with, as he mentioned in the cited quotation that I just read out. This one study did suggest a 50 to 100% replacement, and supposed this to be Anglo-Saxon, or, in the words with the lead geneticist on the project, he said, quote-unquote, or if it were more recent, then it would have to be a greater replacement. Yep, that's right. Dr. Mark Thomas of the University College London, an actual geneticist, suggested that it would have to be greater than a 100% replacement on live television to Francis Pryor in his Britain BC series. Now, using the study here cited, as you'll find in the description below, Dr. Thomas claims that the haplogroups between the Kentish towns and the Frisian towns showed similarities not shared with Welsh towns. So there you have it. An actual geneticist who actually works in an actual university is actually telling you, and the BBC, that he has proof of an Anglo-Saxon migration and replacement after having tested a relatively small number of people in selected towns mentioned in the Domesday Book as to be typical of Anglo-Saxon settlement in England, as well as parts of Wales and part of Frisia. So he's claiming that this haplogroup differential proves his claim about Anglo-Saxon migrations. Now, the fact is, he's merely created a clickbait study misrepresenting his own findings, and, in his abstract, because he mentioned this, he was able to get some press coverage, after all, for this one study, he received more adulation and recognition for all of his work in his past career, and probably for his career the rest of his life. Let's face it, Anglo-Saxon genocide of Celts is more gripping and politically oriented than his work with woolly mammoths, for instance, which, to be honest, I actually found more interesting. His work with woolly mammoths is actually relatively good. In fact, he spent his entire professional career in the 1990s and early 2000s working for Jewish groups supporting their claim of a recent patrilineal common ancestry among the Jewish priestly caste known as the Kohanim. Another point on the study in question is that Dr. Thomas is a molecular phylogeneticist. Now, don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are molecular phylogeneticists, but he's not a population geneticist. Examining paternal lines is what he does. This is in fact what he's qualified to do, what he speaks about. The idea that he might have some notion of the admixture potential on a particular population is unfounded. Simply not in his field, and there's no indication given by him that he's ever educated himself on, the rest of population genetics with regards to total admixture studies and approximations. Furthermore, the department found itself in trouble after the claim was publicised, because obviously it was a sort of clickbait story and it was part of a much larger study. The department found itself in trouble after complaints from ancestry companies. They were receiving complaints from their customers, saying, your test must be wrong, I saw this on the BBC. But also numerous other complaints from other academics and university departments, including the University of Sheffield and Children's Hospital Los Angeles. They both mention the obvious problems with the experiment, the small sample size, the fact that the methodology itself using haplogroups as a sort of proxy for admixture is itself foolish. But also, even with all the implicit priors, there were also some integrity claims, of course, because in the paper the median distance from the true origin was set at 450 kilometres, which is hardly the village-level precision claimed by the typical Anglo-Saxon settlements that they tested. There's basically a huge margin of error there. They probably weren't native to the region if they live 450 kilometres from it. And these departments were complaining to the BBC about the misleading and borderline, just factually incorrect claims of Professor Thomas. So, in response, UCL commissioned a repeat of the study and found that the similarities with Belgium found in the previous study were nowhere to be found. Basically, the regions, the sample that they tested, showed no greater similarity between the English and the Frisians than we would expect. Certainly no haplogroup replacement was found on that particular occasion doing the same study. However, the extent to which the haplogroup is replaced in the southeast of England is probably the result of the small sample size and, of course, the Belgic influence in southern Britain during the Iron Age, where Barry Cunliffe, obviously, and others suggest people in the southeast of Britain and the Netherlands shared these ethno-linguistic ties. Other people who support this would be Simon James, author of The Atlantic Celts, The Ancient People or Modern Invasion, Francis Pryor, Britain BC, Life in Britain and Ireland Before the Romans, John Collins, Celts, Origins, Myths and Inventions, and Colin Renfrew, author of Archaeology and Language, The Puzzle of Indo-European Origins. So, meme study aside, there really are no basis for an Anglo-Saxon replacement, and like certain other unreliable genetics papers in recent years, such as various Indo-European population genetics tests, it's based entirely on Y haplogroup trends. And never forget that there are nearly as many people in Africa with the R1b haplogroup as in Britain. Haplogroups are not genetic similarity, and they are most certainly not admixture approximations. They're merely a way of tracking male ancestry from father to son. So, let's talk no more of haplogroups. If we turn to the only substantive study on admixture tests, we find primarily looking at sort of more consumer and mercantilist-based commercial companies like 23andMe and Family Tree DNA, etc., whereas the more accurate, like living DNA, for instance, has too small a basis for comparison, having so few customers comparative to something like Ancestry. Now, Ancestry has the greatest number of customers, having a database of around 6 million. However, National Geographic doesn't have a much smaller database, and their primary reference in the past has been carefully selected with scientific accuracy in mind, and selecting reference populations based on what we want to find out here, which is the admixture of particular populations throughout time. That's a huge scientific undertaking in many different countries around the world, and it's actually the most accurate, because they examine 700,000 autosomal SNPs, and 20,000 areas of the Y chromosome are examined, which is the most accurate by far. National Geographic is kind of to 23andMe what chemistry is to alchemy, what astrophysics is to astrology. And it has the most relevant reference populations in mind for grouping people together accurately based on genetic similarity, etc., and ancestry, and has the best and most comprehensive breakdown of admixtures for populations, starting in the Mesolithic age and ending in the present day. As we can see here, we have a 69% admixture for Great Britain and Ireland in England. However, the 12% Scandinavian and 5% Southern European have been there since basically the beginning of the Neolithic age. So, that's bearing that in mind, there's not really much room for a large Anglo-Saxon component in that. Would probably be sort of somewhere between the Central and Western Europe and the Scandinavian. The Scandinavian's thought to be much older, totally prehistoric. And the 9% from Central Europe is thought to have been, Roman, along with the Eastern European component. It was due to the colonies in the southeast of England in particular. And of course, this doesn't differentiate much from Scotland. Scotland has slightly more prehistoric foreign sort of Scandinavian DNA. Doesn't really have anywhere near as much of the Atlantic fringe, what we might call the sort of... it doesn't have any extra Celtic DNA, unlike England. Showing no Southern European DNA here. So basically, after the British Isles homogenized into this recognizable and differentiatable and extricatable population from others, Scotland essentially received no additional Southern European or Celtic migration, if you like. Instead, having its foreign admixture coming in from the north, with it being a more northerly country. And so there really isn't much between an Englishman and a Scot. I'm sure there are regional admixture differences in part, but the majority of both populations are the Great Britain and Ireland subgroup. It is actually basically, as Cunliffe and Oppenheimer, amongst others, have said, it appears to be correct, that the British are, in part, descended from the Atlantic coast population and part northern, sort of proto-Northern European, sharing similarities both with the Breton and Basque populations in some regards, whilst in others we share far more similarities with other Northern Europeans. This is being due, of course, to the ancient prehistoric migrations of the Neolithic age. For thousands of years, the majority of the British ancestry has been what we can now call British, showing greater group similarity within the British Isles than without it. This fact alone, and the fact that DNA tests can routinely group Britons together, that they are extricatable from other populations and very difficult to, discern or extricate populations within the British Isles. Combine that with the fact that, of course, we have these ancient phenotypical traits, this phenotypic uniqueness, such as green eyes and freckles and red hair or red colourings in our hair. This makes the British Isles population a single racial or subracial category. It's the only biological category which makes sense genetically and politically, as smaller differences within the British Isles are primarily novel and retain the same cognitive profile, only differing in a few traits and usually not by very much. The IQ of the Irish, is lower due to particular historical trends such as the migration, to Boston in particular. But it's not that much lower. It's not in the 80s somewhere. The English have slightly less red hair and green eyes than, Scotland or Northern Ireland, for instance, for both of those traits. But it's still got far more red hair than even Brittany, even a more sort of phenotypically Celtic population. So we don't differ by very much, and especially not when compared to other nearby or even far afield groups, be they Germans, Spaniards, or the Chinese. Both the Celtic and Germanic cultures are foreign to us. Their religions, languages, and political structures are foreign to us in the grand sense. However, we have had the time to adapt most of these facets of these cultures to our essential particularities, to our common nature. And in so doing, we have crafted for ourselves a dual identity, part Celtic and part Anglo. A single people, a single feed, divided by two foreign cultures, both of which have been adapted for us in different ways. Which is better or preferable, I'm not sure, and I can see great problems with both cultures, as they currently stand and as they've been in the past. I think our goal should be to reconstruct the traditions whilst trying to learn from the base character, the nature of our feed. The culture is always temporary, malleable, and nebulous. What shapes it, and what makes it suitable or unsuitable, is the character of a particular people who will shape the cultural aspects of their society based on their perceived needs. And if you think about, of course, genetic similarity theory, investigated thoroughly by Dr. Philip Rushton, it makes no sense to create sort of greater political arrangements with nations that you are less genetically similar to. You are more similar to your family, whom you have more affinity for. You are less similar to Australian Aboriginals, whom you have less affinity for. And so the optimal model for political affiliation would mirror a model for genetic similarity. So if we were to think about it in terms of a dartboard, you have concentric rings of genetic similarity, which should correspond with genetic rings of political affiliation. And so the Irish, the Australians, etc., these groups are genetically very similar to the UK population as it currently stands. And so it makes perfect sense for us all to be in the Commonwealth together, and for those ties to even possibly be strengthened in some ways. So I hope that's made my position clear on this. I'd love to know what you guys thought. Feedback is always appreciated. Subscribe and like, it's always a pleasure, never a chore.